Welcome back. In recent years, South Africa's relationship with China has deepened. What does this mean for the local economy? Hannah Edinger, the director at Frontier Advisory, has more insight on this. Hannah, thanks. If we look at the relationship between South Africa and China, how important is it? So, help us put it into context for us. If you look at the Eurozone or Europe, and if you look at the US and China, where does this fit in?
Certainly. Thanks for having me this morning. I think China, not only for South Africa, for the whole continent, has become one of the most important commercial partners over the last 5 years in particular. From 2009, the single largest trading partner, one of the largest financiers, particularly on debt financing for the rest of Africa. In the case of South Africa as well, an important partner in FDI. If you compare, particularly on the FDI side, China though to traditional partners, Western partners, the United States, UK, European Union, you'll see that China is still lagging in terms of FDI stock, in terms of FDI flows into South Africa in particular. On the trade side, however, China has become South Africa's single largest trading partner as of 2009. As a region, though, the European Union still eclipses China as South Africa's largest trading partner. But overall, from a commercial perspective, China is a very important partner for not only South Africa, but most of the African continent to date.
So it would make sense for us to keep an eye out on developments that are happening there. Let's look at investment and who's investing from China and where they're investing. What caught my eye was the financial services sector, the likes of ICBC here. And you think about the South African financial services sector, which is very stable, very competitive with our banks. What are they seeing that they can do better? I mean, what is their role here?
Certainly. Maybe to look back a little bit, I mean, South Africa's investment in China actually eclipsed China's investment in South Africa until a few years ago. Looking at the sectors that China's investing in South Africa and the trends we've seen there, it's a bit of a paradox compared to what we've seen in the rest of Africa. Yes, there's a lot of investment in mineral resources, which also makes up more than 90% of our exports, South Africa's export profile to China. But I think the interesting trend is that in recent years, the sectors that we're receiving FDI into have diversified quite rapidly. We're seeing property development, for example. You mentioned the financial sector, although a lot of banks actually have representative offices or branches here rather than committed FDI into South Africa. We're seeing investment in our transport sector. If you look at Transnet, for example, or rolling stock. I think another sector that we should look out for going forward, particularly from an export opportunity, is the agricultural sector and agro-processing sector going forward. On the financial services sector side in particular, I think the main focus is tapping into South Africa's managerial knowledge, our skills in that sector, tapping into greater Chinese flows into Africa, not just into South Africa, and banking ultimately Chinese businesses, Chinese businessmen in this region. And with that, particularly the ICBC investment in Standard Bank sought to position ICBC more so in the 20-odd markets that Standard Bank has a substantial footprint in across the region.
So who's investing? Is it private businesses, government, or a combination of the two?
So over the last 15 years, the largest investors have been state-owned enterprises, part of China's Go Out policy, going global policy, internationalization of big state-owned enterprises in particular. What we will be seeing over the next few years is that diversifying quite rapidly. We're already seeing investment by private Chinese companies across South Africa, in the African region, although this is still dominated by SOEs. And I think this is particularly linked to a mega trend that we're seeing in China, that of China's own structural economic changes that are taking place, where China's moving from being a leading exporter, we all know China as a sort of manufacturing hub of the world, to a leading investor, which we're seeing in Africa already, to ultimately a leading consumer. And what we'll be seeing in line with that trend is offshoring of lower manufacturing value-added industries, similar to what we saw in Japan in the 80s, Korea in the 90s. So particularly on the manufacturing side and private sector investment into manufacturing, we've seen it in renewables, for example, in South Africa. I think that's a space to watch for South Africa, for the region in particular. And I think what South Africa must not be is complacent, because we have a lot of competition emerging on our doorsteps north of South Africa.
So there are all these trade agreements that we've signed with China, not just South Africa, but Africa as a whole. These contracts that have been in place, there have been eyebrows raised over the fairness, saying that it's skewed to favor Chinese investors versus South Africans or Africa. Is this true?
Look, I think in general, the Chinese agenda has been, for Africa generally, has been very much so Chinese. I think we must not be thinking that any of our partners are coming to our shores for altruistic purposes. At the end of the day, what is in it for the US, for the UK, for Germany, for China? Each of the countries ultimately have national interests at heart as well. I think what we are seeing in recent years, and particularly with FOCAP, the Forum China-Africa Cooperation Summit, being hosted in South Africa later this year, which is the triannual forum that really maps the roadmap of China-Africa relations, in which South Africa has been very vocal in, is that we're seeing increasingly, at least, calls for African countries to become more vocal, more involved, more proactive in shaping the agenda. So you're quite rightly, you've mentioned quite rightly that a lot of the contracts, particularly on the financing side, actually have been dictated from the Chinese side. South Africa and Ethiopia have become very vocal in terms of shaping that relationship, particularly the bilateral relationships of these countries with China. I think what we need to see is greater ownership going forward of the relationship by a number of African states. I think the problem becomes there's so many priorities, there's so many partners. It's a fine balancing act at the end of the day.
What about perceptions of Chinese investors into Africa? We do have a number of problems on the African continent. Terrorism comes to mind, although not in South Africa. But what makes Chinese investors wanting to keep coming to Africa to invest here? How are the perceptions changed over the years?
Look, I think we've been involved in a lot of myth busting over the last few years in terms of what China is and what China is not about. And I think similarly so what Africa is and what Africa is not about. But there's a lot of educational exchanges, people-to-people exchanges that are taking place to better understand, particularly to better bridge the cultural deficit that exists between South Africans and China. Even though South Africa has one of the largest Chinese diaspora, Chinese migrant populations in our borders. I think there's a lot of unfortunately false assumptions. There's a lot of sensationalization, unfortunately, of the relationship as well. With, for example, 2015 is the year of China in South Africa. Last year was the year of South Africa and China. Some public diplomacy initiatives of our respective states to help build a better understanding between our respective peoples, given particularly the cultural deficit.
Well, China seems to be getting it right in Africa and in South Africa. Are we getting it right in China?
I think I would correct you on China's getting it right in Africa. I think there's still quite a learning curve for Chinese firms, particularly on the operational side, understanding how African governments, understanding how the private sector works, the small private sector, in some of these markets. And I think the biggest challenge that these companies really are facing is integrating, localizing into the economies, and ultimately what African economies, what we want from FDI is technology transfers, employment creation, etc. So there's a lot that still needs to, I think, that we still need to get right. Looking at South African firms in the Chinese market, I mean, the likes of Naspers, SAB Miller, etc., Discovery, for example, are fantastic case studies. I mean, the thing is they're large, obviously, corporates listed, here on the JSE. I think it's overcoming your initial experience, which sometimes can be a bit negative entering the Chinese market, particularly when you are a smaller business. That said, I think there's some great initiatives by provincial governments in South Africa, for example, to support business opportunities, be it from an export perspective in particular, into the Chinese market, which is overwhelming at best from a size perspective.
Hannah, thank you so much. A lot of work still needs to be done, but looking at this particular relationship between South Africa and China, definitely an important one. Thanks to Hannah Edinger. She is the director at Frontier Advisory.